In the perfect town of Westfield, a child's silent cry goes unheard for years. Hidden in the darkness of a locked basement, Grace Edwards has been trapped by the very people who were supposed to love her. When a nurse and a sheriff uncover the haunting truth, everything they thought they knew about the perfect family unravels. Now they must fight to save a girl whose past holds more secrets than they ever imagined. Will they get to her in time? Or is it too late to break the chains of her torment? If you are new here, then please subscribe this channel and show thumbs up by liking the video. Now let's move to this wonderful story. Emma Harris couldn't shake the feeling that something was off as she stepped out of her car and onto the leaf-strewn driveway. The small town of Westfield had always been a peaceful place with its tree-lined streets and neat houses, but today, it felt different. Her hand tightened around the handle of her medical bag as she glanced at the house in front of her. The Edwards home looked like the kind of house that belonged in a magazine. Perfectly manicured lawns, fresh coats of paint, and tidy, symmetrical windows. From the outside, it was the picture of tranquility. Yet something gnawed at Emma's gut. A quiet voice telling her to be cautious. It was probably nothing, just a routine wellness check, but the anonymous tip had been oddly specific. Check the west wall of the basement. A tip like that wasn't something one could ignore, especially in a town like Westfield where everyone knew everyone else. Deputy Mark Brooks, standing beside her with a flashlight in hand, seemed unfazed. I don't know, Emma. It could be a prank. Kids messing around, you know how it is. The Edwards family? They're practically saints around here, he said, his tone dismissive. Emma glanced at him, her face serious. We can't take any chances. Protocol says we follow up on any specific tip about a child, you know that. She pushed back the rising sense of unease in her chest. She wasn't sure why this case felt different, but she had to trust her instincts. The two of them walked toward the house, the gravel beneath their feet crunching softly. As they reached the front door, Martha Edwards opened it with a forced smile, her blonde hair neatly tied back. She wore a cream-colored sweater and a look of practiced calm. Emma, Mark, what a surprise. Martha greeted them, her voice steady, but her eyes betraying a flicker of concern. Just a routine check, Mark said, his voice casual as he offered a smile. We got a call about Grace. Wanted to make sure everything's okay. Martha's eyes widened slightly before her hand flew to her pearl necklace. Oh, Grace? She's been sick, you know. We've kept her inside, trying to limit exposure to germs. The doctors in Cincinnati recommended it. She's resting upstairs. Emma nodded, her medical instincts kicking in. Everything Martha said made sense, at least on the surface. But something didn't sit right. Grace hadn't been seen around town in months, and Martha's explanation, though smooth, didn't feel entirely genuine. We understand, Emma said, her voice calm and professional. But we still need to see her hospital records. You know, the protocol for adopted children. She noticed Martha's smile falter, a brief hesitation before she spoke again. Robert isn't home, Martha said, her words rushed. I'd rather wait until he's back. This will just take a minute, Mark insisted, stepping forward with a gentle but firm motion. We can do this quickly. Just want to make sure everything's all right. Martha's smile stiffened. She nodded reluctantly and stepped aside to let them in. Fine. She's upstairs in the second bedroom. The house smelled faintly of lavender and freshly baked cookies, comforting, familiar smells that only made the unease in Emma's stomach grow. As they made their way up the staircase, Emma couldn't help but notice how pristine the house was. Every corner seemed perfectly curated, every decoration in its place. But it didn't feel lived in, not in the way a home should. They reached the second bedroom, and Martha opened the door to reveal a child's room decorated in soft pastel colors. Lavender walls, stuffed animals arranged neatly on the bed, books carefully lined up on the shelves. But as Emma stepped inside, she noticed something odd. The room was spotless, almost too clean. No scuffs on the furniture, no sign of use, no fingerprints on the glossy white furniture. Where is Grace? Mark asked, his voice cautious. Martha hesitated, and for a moment, Emma thought she saw a flicker of something. Fear, maybe. But it passed quickly. Oh, she must be in Emily's room. You know, girls love their secrets. Maybe they're having a tea party. They moved down the hall to Emily's room, but the bed was empty. Emily was supposed to be at violin practice according to the schedule pinned to the bulletin board. But the room was silent. Martha, Mark said, his tone more serious now. Where is Grace? I don't appreciate the implication, Martha said sharply, stepping in front of them, her arms crossing tightly over her chest. You've been friends with us for years, Mark. Then, you won't mind if we check the rest of the house, Mark replied, his voice firm. He motioned to the hallway and Emma saw Martha's face drain of color. The tension in the air was palpable, thickening with every passing second. The basement, Emma suggested quietly, remembering the tip that had brought them here. The caller mentioned the basement. Martha's eyes widened, and Emma saw her hand tremble slightly as it moved to her mouth. That's ridiculous, she said, her voice wavering. It's just storage down there, old Christmas decorations and some junk. Her reaction told them everything they needed to know. Emma exchanged a look with Mark, who gave a small nod. We need to check. The stairs leading down to the basement were narrow, the wood creaking under their weight. As they descended, the darkness seemed to close in around them. The basement smelled of damp laundry and cardboard boxes, nothing unusual at first glance. Sheriff Brooks swept his flashlight across the room, illuminating shelves full of storage bins and old workout equipment gathering dust in the corner. Anything unusual? Mark asked, his voice low. Emma scanned the room, counting the walls in her mind, orienting herself. East wall, she murmured. Let's check there. As they moved toward a tall shelving unit, Martha stepped back, her eyes wide with fear. That's just Robert's sports memorabilia. He'll be upset if you move anything. Mark didn't respond, instead sliding the shelving unit aside, revealing a newly constructed door behind it. A lock gleamed ominously in the flashlight beam, and Emma's heart skipped a beat. They had found it. This is it, Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. Mark moved quickly, unfastening the lock with a metallic snap. As the door creaked open, the overwhelming stench hit them first. The smell of fear, unwashed body, and something far worse. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she saw the small skeletal figure huddled in the corner of the dark, windowless room. The child, Grace, didn't move. Her hair was matted and her body was curled tightly against itself as if she were trying to disappear into the floor. Her enormous brown eyes blinked slowly, painfully at the intrusion of light. Oh my God, Emma whispered, dropping to her knees beside the child. Grace? The girl didn't respond. She just stared, those haunting eyes wide, empty, as if they held the weight of centuries. Mark called for backup, but Emma's focus was entirely on Grace. She gently reached for the child's hand, her heart pounding in her chest. She had to get Grace out of here. This wasn't over yet. The dim light from the hallway stretched into the basement as Emma knelt beside Grace, her heart hammering in her chest. The child before her was nothing like the healthy girl the town had whispered about. Grace was too thin, her limbs too frail, her skin a sickly shade of pale. Her clothes, too small and too soiled, hung loosely from her emaciated frame. Emma reached out slowly, her voice soft, barely more than a whisper. Grace, it's okay. I'm here to help. You. The girl didn't flinch. She didn't even blink, her huge brown eyes staring at Emma with an eerie calm that sent a chill through her. The room smelled of decay, old sweat, urine, and the lingering scent of fear. Emma's stomach twisted. This wasn't just neglect. This was something much darker. Grace, can you hear me? Emma asked again, her voice trembling with emotion. But the child didn't respond. She simply sat there, still as a statue, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees as if trying to shrink into herself. Mark stood behind Emma, his flashlight casting long shadows across the concrete floor. His face was set in grim determination. She's been down here for God knows how long, he muttered. This is worse than we thought. Emma's hands shook as she reached out to touch Grace's shoulder, but the child flinched at the contact. Emma froze, afraid she might spook the fragile girl even more, but her heart swelled with protectiveness. She wasn't leaving here without Grace. "It's okay, sweetie," Emma whispered again. "We're going to get you out of here. Everything's going to be okay." With trembling hands, Emma gently lifted Grace's thin arm, coaxing her to stand. The child resisted at first, her body stiff, but eventually Grace allowed Emma to help her to her feet. She could barely support her own weight. Emma's heart broke as she realized how little strength Grace had left. The girl was so small, so fragile, she looked like she might collapse at any moment. Mark, sensing Emma's struggle, stepped forward to help. Together, they guided Grace up the stairs and out of the basement. The moment they reached the fresh air of the front yard, Grace seemed to relax slightly, though she still didn't speak. Emma glanced at her, her brow furrowed with worry. The child's face was vacant, her eyes distant, as if she had shut herself off from the world. "Emma, we need to get her to the hospital," Mark said quietly. "She's not going to survive much longer like this." Emma nodded, her throat tight with emotion. She had known it the moment she saw Grace in that basement. The child had been starved, both physically and emotionally. And yet, there was something else in her eyes. Something that told Emma this wasn't just about what the girl had endured. This was about what had been taken from her. Her spirit, her voice. They rushed Grace to the local hospital, and the emergency room team was waiting for them. As soon as they arrived, the doctors took over, quickly placing Grace on a stretcher and rushing her inside. Emma followed them, her heart racing. She couldn't leave the child now, not after everything she had just witnessed. She had to be there. She had to make sure Grace was safe. Inside the emergency room, the doctors worked quickly, taking blood samples, monitoring her heart rate and assessing her condition. Emma stood off to the side, her hands clenched into fists as she watched them work. She wanted to help, but right now, she was helpless. The child was in the hands of medical professionals, and all she could do was wait. Minutes turned to hours, and Emma's mind raced with questions. How had Grace ended up in this hellhole? Why had no one noticed the signs of abuse? The town had been so quick to paint the Edwards family as perfect, upstanding citizens with a perfect home and perfect lives. No one had seen the cracks beneath the surface. No one had heard Grace's silent cries. It was then that Emma realized the truth. Grace's cries hadn't been heard because no one had bothered to listen. No one had thought to look beyond the Edwards' perfect facade to see the suffering hidden behind it. The people of Westfield had been blind, and now an innocent child had paid the price. The door to the emergency room swung open, and Dr. Susan Clayton, the head pediatrician, stepped inside. Her expression was grave as she approached Emma. "She's stable for now," Dr. Clayton said, her voice steady but filled with concern. "But she's in critical condition. Her body is severely malnourished and she's dehydrated. We're starting her on an IV, but she'll need weeks, maybe even months to fully recover." Emma nodded, her throat tight. "Will she be okay?" "It's hard to say," Dr. Clayton replied. "The physical damage is one thing, but the emotional trauma she's endured, it's going to take a long time to heal. She might not speak for days, maybe weeks. She's not responding to anyone right now, but that doesn't mean she won't." Emma bit her lip, fighting back the tears that threatened to fall. She had no idea how to help Grace recover from this, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to let the child face this alone. She was going to be there every step of the way, no matter how long it took. As the hours passed, Emma stayed by Grace's side, watching as the little girl slept, her small body covered in blankets. She had no idea what Grace's future held, but she would fight for it with everything she had. She would give the child a chance to heal, to speak, to live again. And she would start by listening to the silent cry that had been ignored for so long. Emma sat quietly in the hospital's break room, the mug of coffee in her hands lukewarm as her mind churned. Grace was still in critical condition, and though the doctors had stabilized her, Emma knew this was only the beginning. What haunted her, though, wasn't just the physical damage Grace had endured. It was the deep, unseen wounds that could take years, even decades, to heal. She had to understand what had happened to Grace, what had led to this moment before she could help the girl heal. The town of Westfield had been shaken to its core. How had no one known? How had everyone been so blind to the suffering of a little girl trapped in the very house that seemed like the picture of perfection? Emma couldn't stop thinking about the Edwards family. The entire town knew them. Robert Edwards was a successful insurance agent, a man who seemed to have everything: money, status, respect. His wife, Martha, was the head of the local food pantry, a well-spoken woman who could charm anyone with her warm smile. Their daughter, Emily, was the sweet violin-playing girl everyone adored. They were the kind of family everyone aspired to be. But now, the cracks in the Edwards' perfect life were beginning to show. And the more Emma thought about it, the more she realized how easily the town had been fooled. She had seen it herself. When she walked through their house, everything was spotless. Too perfect. Too perfect, she thought again. There were no signs of lived-in warmth. No evidence of chaos or mess that a family with children should have. But what made Emma's blood run cold wasn't just the house. It was the way Martha had reacted when they had mentioned checking the basement. Emma knew it wasn't just a place for storage, as Martha had claimed. Something about Martha's sudden defensiveness had been enough to convince her. And now, after seeing Grace in the basement, Emma knew that everything she had suspected was true. Still, Emma needed answers. She needed to know how this had happened. Why had no one seen the signs of abuse? The town had been so quick to defend the Edwards family. Had no one really noticed anything? She couldn't shake the thought that something about Grace's past wasn't just tied to the Edwards. What was Martha hiding? The answers came unexpectedly. While Emma was reviewing Grace's medical records, she found a name she hadn't thought of in years. Laura Miller. It was Grace's biological mother. And the more Emma dug, the more pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Laura Miller had been Emma's college roommate, her best friend. They had shared everything: the late-night talks, the laughter, the dreams of their futures. They had been inseparable until life had taken them in different directions. After graduation, Emma had lost touch with Laura. Laura had moved to Seattle to start a new life, and Emma had stayed in Ohio, continuing her medical career. They had exchanged Christmas cards every year, but eventually, even that had stopped. Emma hadn't thought much of it at the time. But now, as Emma stared at the old faded records in front of her, she could hardly breathe. Laura had died in a car accident 6 years ago, along with her husband, James. Their daughter, Grace, had been only 2 years old. How had Emma not known? She had been so wrapped up in her own grief after losing her daughter, Lily, that she hadn't kept up with her best friend. What struck Emma the most, though, was the will. Laura had named Emma as Grace's godmother. She had entrusted her with Grace's care in the event of both her parents' deaths. But no one had contacted her, Emma realized. She had never even been told that Grace was in the foster system. Her hands shook as she read through the legal papers, the truth of it all crashing down on her. Grace had been placed in the foster system after her parents died, but the system had failed her. The records showed that after a brief stay in foster care, Grace had been adopted by the Edwards family. Martha, it seemed, had specifically sought her out. Why? Emma found herself staring at the adoption papers, piecing together a picture she wasn't sure she was ready to see. Martha had known about Laura's will, had known about Emma's connection to Grace, and yet she had taken the child. She had manipulated the system, using her family's status and connections to get what she wanted. It was almost as if she had been waiting for this moment, waiting for Grace to be placed in her home. But the most chilling discovery came next. As Emma looked through old town records, she uncovered something even darker. Martha had a history, a past she had carefully hidden from the rest of the world. She had been raised in a home filled with violence, a home where discipline had been taken to horrifying extremes. Martha's father had believed in harsh, severe punishments, believing that children needed to be broken in order to be fixed. He had locked Martha in dark rooms as punishment, just like she had done to Grace. The weight of it all pressed down on Emma. Martha's actions weren't just the result of poor judgment. They were the result of a cycle of abuse, a cycle that had been passed down from one generation to the next. Martha was a victim too, Emma thought bitterly. But that didn't excuse what she had done to Grace. With each new revelation, Emma's resolve grew stronger. She couldn't let Grace's past define her future. The child had suffered enough. Now it was time for Grace to heal, and for the truth to come out. But there was still so much to do, so many people to confront, so many lies to unravel. The Edwards' perfect life was falling apart. But Emma wasn't done yet. She had to make sure that Grace would never have to live in the shadows again. No child should ever suffer the way Grace had. As Emma looked at the photographs of Grace's biological parents, she whispered a promise to herself and to Grace. "I will protect you." The courtroom was packed, its air thick with tension. Emma Harris sat at the front, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she listened to the arguments. Everything she had worked for, everything she had fought for, was coming down to this. Grace's future depended on the decisions made in this room. Emma wasn't just fighting for custody. She was fighting to break the chains that had bound Grace for so long, to give her a life free from the darkness of the past. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s named Rebecca Morgan, looked over her, glasses at the defense attorney. "Are you ready, Mr. Thorne?" she asked in a voice that commanded attention. "Yes, Your Honor," the lawyer replied, standing tall beside the Edwards family. Robert and Martha Edwards, once pillars of the community, now looked like shadows of their former selves. Martha's face was pale, her eyes red from crying. Robert kept his gaze fixed on the floor, unable to look anyone in the eye. Emma couldn't bring herself to look at them. How had they done this to Grace? How had they hidden it for so long? The defense attorney began, presenting his case with practiced ease. "My clients acknowledge that they made mistakes in handling their daughter's behavior," he said smoothly, his voice calm and professional. "But they acted out of concern for Grace's well-being. They were trying to protect her from her own violent tendencies." The word stung Emma like a slap. Violent tendencies? Grace was a scared, broken child, not a violent threat. She had to stay calm. She had to remember that this wasn't just about the lies they were telling. It was about Grace's future. Grace needed to be heard. Emma took a deep breath and stood. When it was her turn to speak, her hands were trembling, but she didn't let it show. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady. "The evidence in this case speaks for itself. The medical reports, the testimony from doctors, and the physical signs of abuse all point to one undeniable fact. Grace was kept in that basement, locked away, isolated from the world. She was starved, not just of food, but of love and human connection. The abuse she suffered was not out of concern, it was out of cruelty." The room was silent as Emma's words sank in. She glanced over at Grace, who was sitting quietly with Dr. Morris in a small room just off the courtroom. The little girl was holding Mr. Hops tightly, her favorite stuffed rabbit. Emma knew Grace was scared. She had seen the fear in her eyes. But Grace was here. Grace was fighting for herself, for her future. The psychological damage caused by such severe neglect and isolation is profound. Emma continued. "This isn't just about what Grace has suffered physically. It's about how the trauma has shaped her mind, her sense of self-worth. No child should have to endure what she did, and no parent, no person, should have the power to break a child like this." The defense attorney stood, but Emma was ready for him. He tried to downplay the evidence, arguing that Martha had been under a great deal of stress, that the family had been struggling with Grace's behavior. "It wasn't perfect," he admitted, "but they did what they thought was best." What they thought was best? Emma's voice was sharp now, her anger rising. What's best is not locking a child in a basement. What's best is not using chains, not using restraint, not hiding a child away like she's a secret. Grace was never the problem. Martha and Robert were the ones who failed her. They failed her every single day she was in that house. defense attorney faltered for a moment, but he recovered quickly, trying to paint Martha as a loving mother who simply couldn't handle the stress. But the truth had already been laid bare for everyone to see. The evidence was irrefutable. Martha's face was crumpled, her eyes wide with fear. She hadn't expected this. She had thought that her polished image, the years of community service, would protect her. But none of that could shield her from the reality of what she had done. The lies she had spun, the facade she had built, were crumbling. Robert, too, seemed smaller than before. Emma caught a glimpse of his face, and for the first time she saw something resembling guilt. Was he truly remorseful? Or was he just afraid of losing his comfortable life? Either way, it didn't matter anymore. They had done irreparable harm to Grace, and now they had to face the consequences. The judge's gavel came down sharply, signaling the end of the proceedings for the day. "I have heard enough," Judge Morgan said, her voice firm and unwavering. "This case is about a child, and that child deserves justice." The next morning, the courtroom was filled with anticipation as the judge returned with her verdict. Emma sat in her seat, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, her heart racing. She had done everything she could to protect Grace. Now it was in the judge's hands. The judge cleared her throat and looked directly at Martha and Robert. After reviewing the evidence, including testimony from medical professionals, the reports of psychological evaluations, and the circumstances surrounding Grace's adoption and treatment, this court finds that the Edwards family is unfit to continue as Grace's guardians. There was a moment of stunned silence before the judge continued. "Custody of Grace Miller is hereby granted to Emma Harris, in accordance with the wishes of her biological mother, Laura Miller." Emma's breath caught in her throat. It was over. Grace was going to be safe. Grace's future was now in her hands, and she would never let go. As the courtroom began to empty, Emma made her way to Grace's side. The little girl looked up at her with wide eyes, a small glimmer of hope shining through the darkness. For the first time in a long while, Grace didn't look so lost. She looked like a child again. "You're coming home with me," Emma said, softly, her voice filled with promise. And Grace finally gave her a small, hesitant smile. It was a start, a beginning. It would take time, but with Emma by her side, Grace would learn to trust again. She would learn to smile again. And one day she would be free.